Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We're still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Our last lecture was on chapter 14, Race and Economics, where we discussed the ways in which ethnicity is used for social power. We discussed the ways in which culture, specifically ethnic identity and ethnic solidarity, positively influences the economy. We looked at several examples of different ethnic groups and their successful attempts at utilizing their ethnic identities and utilizing ethnic solidarity as a way of developing their group's economic consciousness as well as their economic destinies. And so in this lecture, we will discuss the short-term and long-term benefits of African and African Americans investing in trading with African nations. We're focusing on chapter 16 of the Blueprint for Black Power. And so for the next 2 to 3 chapters, we will focus on Dr. Wilson's key reminders that we are beneficiaries of a rich tradition. According to Dr. Wilson, the time to invest in Africa is now. And so despite the fact that few African American individuals or business investors are prepared or in a place to engage in direct foreign investment in Africa, and Wilson defines foreign investment and the possibilities of foreign investment as the founding and owning of businesses or entering into joint ventures and partnerships, right? And so while few individual African businesses and investors may be in a position to take advantage of this, the opportunities are ever increasing for investors to engage in diverse portfolio investments. According to Wilson, portfolio investments, some examples of that can be the buying of stocks or other equities, right? And so the possibilities are ever increasing for folks who are looking to diversify their portfolios. Wilson argues that the investment can prove to be mutually beneficial for all parties involved. And so with solid political and economic reforms, the potential for foreign investment is exponential. In different African countries, there is a great need for specific political and economic changes and improvements to happen. But even without those wide scale or whole scale political and economic reforms, we already see this type of foreign investment happening between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent. Wilson is encouraging us to beef this up, right? 10, 20, 40 fold. So Wilson argues that for investors that are willing to take some risk, and there is some risk involved, right? They could stand to take advantage of the fact that African stocks are relatively inexpensive. Given that some African countries are in its infancy stages, right, with this type of economic development, folks will essentially be getting in the ground level, right? And so there's a lot of room for growth, a lot of opportunities for growth here. And so those investors would be benefiting from that type of growth. Wilson also argues that investors can spread or hedge their risk by investing in a mutual fund. And so Dr. Wilson defines a mutual fund, or a mutual fund is a type of financial vehicle. It's made up of a pool of money collected by individual investors, right, for the goal of investing in certain securities like stocks or bonds or different money market instruments. And so Black businesses, Black organizations, right, their CEOs and leaders, they would pool this money, right, with the intent of investing it in particular stocks for the benefit of the community, right, for the benefit of the African diaspora. And so we would be investing in emerging African markets. We recognize these African markets as a potential place of economic prosperity, economic development for African people. And as we keep going further in this lecture, we're going to talk about that these places are potentialities for African resettlement. According to Dr. Wilson, the gross national product, the GNP, which explains the market value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in 1 year, uh, as well as the population sizes of African nations where capital markets have been developed or are in the process of developing, right? These nations, their citizens and entrepreneurs mutually benefit themselves, right? By coming to understand Africa and other Black nations as natural locations for investment and business alliances. Once we as African people the world over start to see African nations, African countries, Black nations, Black countries, right, as natural places for us to invest our money, natural places for us to relocate and resettle, natural places for us to build business, economic, and political alliances with folks, right? Once we come to understand that, we will be on the path, right, to our economic prosperity, to our economic development. All right. Wilson argues that these nations should be considered as possible places for resettlement and contribute to their economic, social, political, and cultural development. So again, the goal isn't for us to make individual African capitalists, right? To make a whole bunch of Black millionaires and billionaires, right? The goal is for us to improve the social, economic, political, and cultural development of our African nations. The goal is to end white domination, right? That is the point. That is the purpose of this work. Early American and European investment relations, according to Dr. Wilson, from the colonial era to the First World War, the United States was a debtor nation, right? And what that simply meant was that it owed more than it was owed. Wilson explains that this was a result of the lack of non-resident or the lack of foreign investment from abroad by specifically European entrepreneurs. So in the colonial period, America was a relatively poor nation, right? And they owed more money. They were in debt. They owed more money than money was owed to it. And so once this changed, Wilson argues, European investors made major investments in American land, mining, manufacturing, as well as in insurance, trading, banking, and finance and transportation, i.e. the American railroads, governmental securities, and other commercial activities. Citing historian Mark Thomas, Wilson argues that foreign capital gave colonial America the opportunity to forge a strong dynamic economy, right? And that instead of looking at foreign capital as an evil, that it ought to be viewed as a very valuable luxury. Okay, and so America during the colonial periods came to understand foreign investment as a luxury. Right? If we're going to succeed, we need this foreign investment. According to Wilson, foreign investors were crucial to American success. Whether it was the plantations of the Chesapeake, the factory houses of Norfolk and Charleston, the trading concerns of New York or Boston, the ironworks of rural Pennsylvania, all were dependent on foreign finance. The American canals and railroads were developed with foreign investment. Wilson reminds us that the United States economic development was not financed solely by indigenous means. European financial establishments, its investors, trade alliances supported the development of the European American nation, that is the United States. Right? America would not have developed into the 13 colonies, let alone these 50 plus states and territories without Europe's direct investment. Okay, Wilson reminds us of the economic and political relationships between Europe and the United States. This relationship has always been a reciprocal relationship, empowering the right reign of supremacy in both its international and national boundaries, right? In the same ways that Europe and the United States have had this symbiotic and reciprocal relationship with one another. In this chapter, in the next few chapters, Wilson is going to encourage African Americans to develop a similar type of relationship with Africa and African nations, right? That Africans throughout the diaspora should be investing and trading with continental Africans and vice versa. Okay, this was how the Americas became successful. This is how Europe became successful. because of those relationships. Pan-African trade alliances. According to Dr. Wilson, the mutual economic development and political empowerment of Black America and Africa requires the development of African American and continental African business and financial alliances, as well as social cultural relations. What Wilson is arguing here is that in order for African American businessmen and women to be able to economically and politically support our brothers and sisters in Africa, is that we have to build alliances. We have to build an infrastructure and develop an infrastructure that allow for these alliances to be developed, right? In order for our brothers and sisters on the continent of Africa and African nations, the African diaspora, in order for them to support African Americans, right? We have to improve the infrastructures that allow for us to develop these alliances, right? For us to improve our relations with one another, right? And so until that happens, we cannot adequately and effectively, right, support our brothers and sisters economically and politically. Citing Peter Drucker, Wilson argues that all economics is international, right? Wilson argues that the service trade of all developed countries are growing so fast that the service trade in 10 years could replace the merchandise trading, right? According to Wilson, knowledge is the basis of most service export and imports. The major basis for facilitating this trend is the formation of business alliances, right, such as joint ventures, partnerships, subcontracts, knowledge agreements, and outsourcing arrangements. You need individuals on the ground and in these economic networks who understand this contract language, how to write these contracts, right? How to train the people to be great stewards of the resources and the money that they receive. And so again, this is a lot of knowledge that has to be traded. Folks have to be trained in. And Wilson and others are predicting that it is the trading of knowledge and information, right, that in the next few years could actually replace the factory assembly lining of merchandise, right, but is now more focused on the trading of knowledge and information. And we discussed some of this in chapter 12 when we were explaining the shifts in the American economy and the reasons for those shifts. One being America's selling of technical and scientific information to foreign competitors, right? We argued that many of America's quote-unquote competitors were able to make parity with America, and in some cases even surpass America's economy as a result of America selling its technological and scientific information to other countries, right? As a result of foreign countries acquiring this information, it has triggered a change in the demand for merchandise production to the trading of services. Wilson made the argument that no one African country or no one African American population would need to sustain all of the risk, right? And that this risk could be spread out. And so Wilson provides an example. He says an African American company may assume the responsibility for the design and marketing for Afrocentric sneakers. All right, let's say that an African nation, an African country wanted to develop, distribute an Afrocentric sneaker. Well, that sneaker company did not necessarily need to be located on the continent of Africa. That factory, that distribution company could be housed in the United States. Okay, and so Wilson is providing some creative ways of thinking about how we can develop an infrastructure that does not currently exist, right? And construct it to our own purposes and for our own benefits. So let's say an African American company may assume the responsibility for the design and marketing for an Afrocentric sneaker or other products. and then they enter into an alliance with a continental or diasporan firm to manufacture the sneakers, right? Or other products. Either America could be responsible for the manufacturing or the distribution, right? A different African nation, African country could take the responsibility for the designing, the financing, right? But again, no one country, no one place would take all of this risk. Such an alliance consequently creates jobs and opportunities in both the African American community as well as in the African continental or diasporan country or communities. African and diasporan companies could produce through joint ventures American and African American design goods in African and diasporan countries for the markets in those countries. So the goods that we are producing, right, whether in America or Africa, will be sold in both markets, right? In that African nation, they are selling and distributing African American goods as well as African goods, right? And vice versa. Solutions. According to Dr. Wilson, a Pan-African economy requires formal and informal alliances, right? One of the reasons why we have not yet seen the wholesale development of international trade between African Americans and Africans is because we have not developed the alliances, right, that needs to be developed for something like this to happen. And so these alliances must pool knowledge, finance, and markets. Alliances between Black universities, their research staff, labs, and departments, between university research labs and departments and businesses, both within the African American community and across the African diaspora. So our universities have to be talking to each other. The departments, the different social, scientific departments have to be communicating with each other. Our lab departments have to be communicating with each other. All right. And so alliances between banks, producers, mutual funds, and other institutions are critical possibilities as well. And so the banks in Africa that are Black owned, Black ran, with the Black financial institutions in America that are Black owned and Black ran, right? They have to be talking and communicating with each other for us to build those effective alliances. Global policy is local. We discussed in chapter 12 how despite the major shifts in the global economy, the white corporate elite has maintained their control and influence. The corporate elite has been able to counter and even neutralize organized labor attempts to increase wages and force leadership to capitulate to workers' demands by simply relocating and recreating those same companies overseas. Wilson argues here that there's no separation between domestic and foreign affairs because the domestic and the foreign interests are one and the same now. Wilson argues that as the U.S. becomes more ethnically diverse, the economic, social, and political incentives to emphasize one's ethnic identity, it increases. The global economy is becoming more diverse, and where the push in the past was for folks to shed their ethnicities and become more Americanized or become more Europeanized, right? We don't see that anymore. As the world has become more diverse, it has been in the interest of ethnic groups to retain their ethnic identities, right? And to develop ethnic solidarity, right, in the business, political, and educational spaces. Wilson argues that the pressure for ethnic groups to share their ethnic identities and become Americanized is not as intense as it once was in this country. Ethnic immigrants have resisted this pressure to amalgamate into the larger American society, opting to maintain their connections with their countries of origin. As a result, Wilson argues the development abroad are measurably going to influence the political, social, and economic activities here in America and vice versa, right? As America becomes more diverse, it becomes informed by the political developments in other countries, right? America becomes impacted by them as well. Because America has citizens, they have folks who occupy land here in America who have connections and families and resources in other countries. And so whatever happens in those other countries, it impacts those individuals who live and reside back here in America, and vice versa. The political and social currents that take place here in America, it impacts um, those countries that have American businesses that are connected to American political, economic, and social interests. They too are impacted. And so there is no separation between the foreign and the domestic. In chapter 12, we talked about how the white corporate elite have been able to relocate their businesses, their political and economic interests. They've been able to recreate those in other nations, in other countries. And thus, there is no separation between their American and domestic interests, right, and their foreign and international interests. Solutions. According to Dr. Wilson, if the African American community can markedly increase its internal trading, its internal finance, and service activities within and between its local and regional communities, and markets within the general American market, if the African American community can become the central trading, finance, and service hub for the vast African diaspora community and build its trade alliances with this community, it can thereby stem its increasing unemployment, resulting from the deindustrialization of America. And we discussed that in chapter 12 as well. If African Americans, right, are able to improve their alliances with brothers and sisters in Africa, right? If our brothers and sisters in Africa are able to improve their alliances with their brothers and sisters in America, we can do something about this wide-scale unemployment, right, that the African has been forced to suffer from disproportionately than all other groups of people. We can do something about this deindustrialization, right, that Black folks in America have become impacted by disproportionately than all other groups of folks. We can start to create some increased employment opportunities for our own members, right, both here at home as well as abroad. The possibilities of an African investment fund. According to Wilson, the growth of Africa's stock markets means that there already exists an effective means for African American investors, investment, and contributing to the economic advancement of Africa, right? There's already a tool and mechanism and system for us as African American people to start to trade with our brothers and sisters in Africa. There's already a mechanism in place for our brothers and sisters in the continent to start to trade with us, right? So that's a great sign. Wilson argues that the mutual investment funds will allow investment risks to be shared across the African American community so that no one community has to sustain all the risk of any investment. The benefits of this investment would be equity ownership in Africa's wealth, in Africa's production, developing long-term alliances with African nations that permits a continuation of trade and exchange, and lastly, and maybe most importantly, the ability to contribute to the growth and development of Africa. This is what the creating of an investment fund in Africa will give us. It would allow us to now contribute to the development of our motherland. We could starchly decrease the need of all of this European aid into Africa, right? And we could really start to fund the growth of the continent. Wilson envisions the creation of an African Diaspora Management Corporation that once created would raise several hundreds of millions and eventually billions for a fund to invest in large long-term infrastructure projects in Africa. So this African Diaspora Management Corp, right, would be responsible for improving the livelihoods of Africans throughout the diaspora, investing in large long-term infrastructure projects in roads, building bridges. This fund would be responsible for the investments in projects such as developing agricultural sectors, developing products and plantation, products for developing energy, developing transportation, developing electrical power and petrochemicals, developing more housing, retail, export, and healthcare industries. Right? The creation of this African Diaspora Management Corporation would allow us to be able to finance our own wishes, our own dreams. Wilson reminds us that investing and trading in Africa by African American businesses have already started, and it can be used as examples to aid in the development of various investment funds. One such example is the African Development Public Investment Corporation of Hollywood. I was extremely happy to read about this and learn about the African Development Public Investment Corporation. I was a baby when this corp was established, and kind of sad to know, right, that it doesn't exist anymore, right? But a brother by the name of Dick Griffey founded in 1985 the ADPI, right? And the ADPI specialized in African commodities, specialized in air trading services, specialized in oil trading. ADPI achieved sales of nearly 60 million in 1993. He was a black man who was running a music company. He did a lot of promoting and things of that nature, who had now created the African Development Public Investment Corporation, who wanted to get involved, right, in the African Revolution. He wanted to get involved in the African Liberation Movement. And he thought that his best contribution would be creating a fund, a corporation such as this. The power of investments. According to Dr. Wilson, international mutual funds are currently serving as an alternative to banks for many developing nations. Citing a Wall Street Journal from 1994, found the emerging economies of Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa are beneficiaries of mutual fund investments. The report found that the funds could facilitate easier access to governmental officials and bureaucratic decision makers. Mutual funds allow for monies to be withdrawn at any time, and it provides freedom and flexibility that the traditional banks don't provide. Folks are looking to get away from having to borrow money from the banks. We talked about this in chapter 14 and chapter 12, how other ethnic groups have been able to develop indigenous means of financing their hopes and their dreams. Whether it's going to their different family members for the money, right? Whether it's them pooling their money through the different K system. Folks are looking for alternative ways to develop and raise money without having to go to the banks. And mutual funds is such an alternative. Mutual funds allow for monies to be withdrawn at any time, and it provides freedom and flexibility that the traditional banks don't provide. You can't just take money out of the bank. You can't just have a bank loan money to you whenever you want to, right? There's a lot of red tape involved. International trade centers. According to Dr. Wilson, the ability of African American firms to trade across the African diaspora could be facilitated by the active involvement of international trade centers. Trade centers would allow African American businesses to trade with Africans anywhere in the world. So that would be the point of a trade center, right? It would give us the opportunity as African people, right, as Africans here in America, to trade with our brothers and sisters throughout the diaspora, right? The World Trade Center that we had before was currently bombed and destroyed, right? Allowed America to trade with the larger international scene. These trade centers would allow African American businesses to trade with Africans anywhere in the world. So the proposed International Trade Center that Wilson is going to introduce here in a little bit is based on the plans that were proposed by the Harlem Third World Trade Institute and the Harlem Urban Development Corporation. We're going to talk a little bit about the Harlem Third World Institute because Wilson introduced it to us, right? And so I was very interested to find out what this institute was, and find out a little bit about its creator. And so Harlem was looking to become the trading center of the so-called Third World, according to Wilson and others. And so the idea for the Harlem Third World International Trade Center originated from plans to have the World Trade Center built in Harlem instead of Lower Manhattan. Black folks wanted an investment from the local government to help improve Harlem. And residents of Harlem thought that the World Trade Center being built in Harlem would provide such investment, right? However, we know that the World Trade Center eventually was built in Manhattan. And so, according to Sawadago, the Harlem Urban Development Corporation established the Harlem Third World Institute in the late 1970s and the late 1980s to establish the Harlem International Trade Center. So, according to testimony provided by an H. Carl McCall before the 1989 Committee on Ways and Means, the House of Representatives, McCall states that for almost 10 years, the Harlem Third World Trade Institute, also known as the Institute, a program of the Harlem Urban Development Corporation, worked to develop and enhance the entrepreneurial potential of American minority and small businesses to engage in international trade, right? So the Harlem Urban Development Corporation recognized that American minority businesses and American small businesses didn't really have international trade acumen, and thus wanted to do something about that, right? And thus the Third World Trade Institute would be committed to providing that type of training and type of education for the community. According to Sawadago, the Institute has developed programs on and provided training in export and import development and has brokered over 56 million of international trade transactions since its founding in the 1980s. And in pursuit of its objectives, have hosted over 20 visiting heads of state and numerous representatives of government and business of the Third World. So here, the Third World Institute was able to get leaders of African states, right, to travel to America and to investigate how serious we were about creating such a trading institution. How serious were we to committing ourselves to building these kind of alliances, right, with our brothers and sisters throughout the diaspora? Because if we build them, our brothers and sisters will engage, they will come. Wilson argues that decentralized trade centers, and all a decentralized trade center is, it is a physical space, right, that contains digital technology that allows business representatives and other entities to trade and deal securely with each other without having to meet traditionally or through third parties. And so it's a technological hub, right, with computers and, representatives from African nations or representatives of African American businesses could meet virtually in these trade through this trade center and get business done securely. It could be designed to achieve purposes similar to those of the Harlem Third World Trade Center. The main purpose of the trade centers would be to stimulate and promote international trade between African American community and the nations of the world. That would be the point and purpose of a decentralized trade center, right? With technology today, we recognize the opportunities to cut out middlemen, cut out gatekeepers that prevented the successful flow of business. With these decentralized trade centers, we could cut out middlemen and allow these countries and businesses to deal with each other directly. Additionally, the trade centers will provide one-stop complexes, which would handle all aspects of the trade negotiations and transactions, right? So the decentralized trade center would be a one-stop shop for all things related to international trade. Here, Wilson lays out what the proposal, right, for the trade center and what that looks like. He took this directly from the Harlem Third World Trade Center and its proposal for the International Trade Center being built there. And so, according to this proposal, the purpose of the proposed International Trade Center will be the purpose of the complex is to provide a multi-use 24-hour activity center that will function as a business center for the United States International Trade Center. In addition to strengthening trade ties between the United States and developing nations, it is hoped that the center will be a catalyst for the social and economic revitalization of Harlem. All right, since this International Trade Center was going to be built in Harlem, the goal was really for the improvement of the local Harlem community. So wherever the trade center actually is developed, right, in any Black nation, right, we want to see that Black nation, that Black community improve, right? The services, the complex and its facilities are expected to encourage technological development in health and agriculture and foster trade education through conferences, seminars, promote tourism through its tourist information offices. And so the services that this trade center would provide, right, would be in the development of the whole scale technological development. We're trying to improve, the agricultural development, which all requires technological development as well, right? There's new, more efficient ways of doing agriculture. And so we want all of the modern mechanisms to allow us to do that. The participants, who's participating? Developing nations and businesses, international financing institutions, United States agencies involved in international trade, major United States corporations, and major international airlines will participate in this ambitious project. The concept, the International Trade Center is designed to achieve the following goals. The establishment of New York, or whichever locale that the trade centers end up being developed in, as the center for trade for developing nations, right? And so if we were to develop, let's say, 2 or 3 trade centers in the United States, it wouldn't be necessarily important for those 3 locales to be the center of international trade. But we recognize the need for international trade to be centralized. So for all of the various steps in the process of developing that agreement between both nations, right? All of that needs to happen in one place, in one facility, okay? We could have multiple trade centers, but each of those trade centers would need to be equipped to handle the entire aspect of that trade process, right? The goal is for the acceleration of the development, right, and the expansion of jobs and business opportunities wherever these trade centers are located. We want to develop more jobs, right? We want to put folks to work who have the particular skills and the talents in this particular field. The development of one-stop trade center to facilitate the export-import business between developing nations and the U.S. Again, we just want these nations, these companies, to be able to go to that center, right, and get done everything that they need to get done, right, and not have to bureaucratically hop from place to place. The collection and dissemination of trade information from U.S. firms and developing nations, right? There is a cross flow of information, and we're communicating between nations. And then the provisions of services for U.S. companies, particularly small, medium-sized companies, which are unable to send representatives to foreign countries, we're able to mitigate that through the technology, right? For folks unable to travel, right, for whatever reason, finances, we have a global pandemic happening right now. The technology would be able to circumvent that, and representatives would still be able to meet and get business done. Wilson reminds us that the basic concept and operation of a local trade center need not be as elaborate as the one just laid out. Wilson argues that an upstart trade center may be little more than a computer facility with a conference room attached, right? As long as there is a means for the representative of the African nation, right? The representative of the African American business, in order for these two parties to be able to meet, right? Do we have a stable internet connection, right? Do we have all the resources that we're going to need to make that transaction complete? Do we have all those things in house? And as long as we have all those things, right, um, everything else is kind of just supplementary. So Wilson argues that an upstart trade center may be a little more than a computer facility with a conference room attached. The computer facility would maintain a complete and up-to-date bank containing businesses, entrepreneurs, agencies, and the like located in the African diaspora and countries who are seeking various services like business contacts, deals, joint ventures, African American businesses, professionals, persons and services interested in international trade, financial and consulting services, right? All of the information necessary to facilitate the making and closing of trade deals and agreements, right? That is what we need the International Trading Center to do. The services that the Third World Institute would provide, right? It would act as a brokerage. So sellers and buyers are brought together. They're taken through the steps of a trade deal. So let's say letters of credit, document filing, insurance and freight forwarding. The trade center would act as a brokerage, right? For either one party or both parties to ensure that the trade deal gets done. The trade center would provide referrals. So if the needs of a business person cannot be met by the trade center, referrals are made to government agencies that can best help that individual. The networks could include the International Trade Administration, the U.S. Department of Commerce, different banks, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Recognizing that the International Trade Center may not be everything for all people, right? Where it could not meet the needs of a particular individual or group or business, the Institute would make the referral. The Institute would also act as a language laboratory. The laboratory will be designed to assist minority and small entrepreneurs in understanding the most widely used languages in international markets, notably French, Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic. By providing these language tools, the Trade Center assists participants in international trade, overcome some of the social cultural barriers of working in and training with foreign countries. We want to eliminate any language barriers, right? And so the language laboratory will provide those services. The Institute will provide translating services. So in dealing in international trade, many minority and small businesses enter into negotiations with countries where the official language is other than English. Contracts, joint venture proposals, letters, and telecommunications have to be translated, right? And so we provide those translation services. Again, we don't want language to be a barrier to getting the trade and getting the business done. The Institute will provide conferences and seminars. The Trade Center regularly conducts workshops and seminars. These meetings have panel presentations on marketing strategies, export opportunities, local export and import incentives, legislation on international trade, and United States and foreign governments and trade regulations. So these seminars and conferences will serve as the educational platforms, right, to keep all members, to keep all participants educated, keeping them compliant, and able to take advantage of the ever-changing processes involved, right, in an economic model. Some of the programs that an international trade center could provide are export and import developments. According to Wilson, the export-import developments would be designed to assist individuals, businesses, foreign governments in the arrangement, negotiation of transactions in international trade. Components include export and import financing through private lending institutions and government agencies, joint venture investments in overseas markets, and trade missions to and from developing nations. Right? We want to familiarize African and African American businesses with the intricacies, the nuances, right, of private lending, right, versus governmental lending, right? Those are total different processes depending on how you're financing any of these initiatives, right? There's going to be loopholes. There's going to be a red tape, and the export-import development leaders are going to teach and train folks, right, how to navigate those scenarios. How-to sessions, right? An ongoing service of entrepreneurs who want to explore export potential. The different types of export firms are covered. So export-import companies, export trading companies, trade consultants, manufacturing representatives, right? All of this is about training folks how to trade. We assume that everybody will have the advantages and the opportunities of going to a college or going to a university and studying economics 101, right? Or going to business school and studying business 101, right? But everybody will not have that benefit. And if we are waiting for everybody to be trained in a traditional sense, right, and acquire degrees in order to go into these fields, then we're going to be waiting for quite a long time. And the African American community is in no position to wait, right? And so these how-to sessions, these types of community programs that's willing to teach import-export trading, right, are going to be the alternative tools that men and women are able to use to take advantage of the lack of resources in our community. Educational program provided by the International Trade Center, the provision of information to minority and small businesses on the advantages, complexities, and possible pitfalls of international trade, right, would be some of the topics, right, would be a part of the curriculum. The program draws on the knowledge and insights of professionals in business, government, and academia. The center, in collaboration with the local university and city colleges, may conduct internship programs which provide undergraduate and graduate level students with practical experience in international trade, right? And so the local colleges and local universities, right, will also be able to benefit from these trade centers by providing their students with practical training and practical knowledge. Another program provided by the International Trade Center would be international networking. Africa and the Caribbean are the areas of the third world in which much of the center's programs and activities will be focused, right? It's where much of the development is needed, right? And so by and through letters of introduction to firms across the world, other nations have indicated an interest in opening trade doors to the U.S. through the trade centers. The centers should also sponsor a program to establish ongoing relationships with countries in Asia, Latin America, and the South Pacific Islands. And so while we are first concerned with the developing of the African and African American infrastructures, right, the building of African and African American alliances, right, and strengthening the trading apparatus between Africans and African Americans, the trade is not limited to trade between Africans and African Americans. We want to trade with the entire world. We want to trade with the entire world. Unfortunately, we've just been locked out of them, right? We've been excluded and isolated from them. But based on the work that Wilson has laid out for us to do, we can change the nature of this isolation. All right. Other programs that the International Trade Center can provide would be the Arts and Crafts Merchandise Mart. Right. So according to Wilson, the central objective of the project is to assist third world countries in their economic development by providing a vehicle to market handcrafted merchandise in the U.S. and Canada. The center realizes that craft export sales is a potential major foreign exchange earner, and that the handicraft industry is a primary source of sustained employment for rural households within the third world. We have not effectively tapped into the potentiality of handcraft trading. Africans throughout the diaspora have a value for handcrafted, genuine African merchandise, right? But we have yet to really set up the infrastructure for the full-scale trading of handcraft goods. Job Skills Data Bank Service, a program which offers employment opportunities in developing nations to the many United States-based minority professionals and technicians, providing training facilities and partial funding of specific manpower planning and development projects and research, labor recruitment, counseling, consulting, socioeconomic development, agriculture, and human services. These programs will be committed to the training and the developing, right, folks going into banking. We need more of our people to be educated and be of the mind of finances. We need revolutionary financiers, all right? And our job skills data bank service could provide such training. Another program that the International Trade Center could provide is one for our foreign visitors. And so this program is dedicated to fostering mutual trade relationships between public and private concerns in the third world and small minority businesses in the United States. All right. The Trade Center would regularly play host to the heads of state and government and dignitaries and entrepreneurs from third world countries visiting the U.S. Right. African American representatives will host African heads of states, African government leaders, African dignitaries, right? Introducing them to the different aspects of the Trade Center, but introducing them to the African American community, the social and cultural politics of the community, helping them to understand how valuable these particular African American communities are and why these places should be invested in, why Africans should consider reselling or relocating, right? And vice versa. When African American representatives, African American CEOs of businesses, heads of institutions and organizations head over to Africa, right? The African leadership is responsible there for getting African Americans to understand this particular African nation as a potential place to invest in and a potential place to resettle, to relocate. And this is how we're building these alliances and building these relationships for the long haul. This chapter, again, was dedicated to getting African American and Africans to understand the benefits, the short and long-term benefits of us investing and trading with one another. Our next lecture is going to focus on chapter 17, right? Empowerment through wealth. What Wilson has been trying to do for the last couple of chapters by presenting us and showing us the role that ethnicity plays in the economic prosperity of a nation. If African American people are going to have that same type of prosperity, we have to start to conceptually view ourselves, right, as a nation. We have to have this group ethnic identity and ethnic solidarity, right? We got to change the nature and how we relate to each other, and we got to start investing and aligning ourselves with our brothers and sisters on the continent. And so Wilson has been laying out for us that we as African American people are a part of a long, rich tradition of commerce, of trading, right? Of being nation builders. And all we have to do is revise, right? Revitalize those aspects of our personality. We just got to bring it back to life. We don't need to mimic any other group, right? We don't need to follow in the footsteps of any other group. We just simply need to remember who we are. Thank you, family. I look forward to your attention as we jump into our next lecture on chapter 17. Peace, family.